The following show is brought to you in partnership with the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History, Blue Star Strategies, Bright Road Incorporated, Make It Plain Podcast, and RPC Media.
Campus of the University of the District of Columbia. This is State of Play.
Welcome to State of Play. Our topic today, the Essential Immigrant. And of course, with me, Karen Tramontano and the Reverend Mark Thompson. And to help us get started, we have an exceptional guest. She's the Lung Family Professor of Asian American Studies and Professor of History at Columbia University, Professor Mae Ngai. Thank you so very much, Professor, for being with us.
My pleasure.
I think you almost better than anyone define that arc of history around the immigrant in America. And you help us by saying the colonists were settlers, not immigrants. Can you sort of elaborate upon that?
Right. Thank you. We have in this country a story that we tell. It's a myth that America is a nation of immigrants. Now, we have a lot of immigrants in America, but not everybody who came here was an immigrant. The first Europeans who came to North America were colonial settlers. They weren't immigrants in the sense that we think of immigrants as people who come to join a society that already exists. They did not come to join Native American society. They came to eliminate Native Americans so they could set up a European society. Similarly, Africans who came as slaves to the United States were not immigrants. They came against their will. They came in chains. So we lose a lot of what our history is about if we think everybody was an immigrant.
You mentioned the enslaved people, Professor. I remember reading in history about a former enslaved person, Frederick Douglass, and how he was outspoken in the 1800s against early xenophobia against Chinese immigrants. And it was the Chinese Exclusion Act where America's bureaucracy or immigration policy, bureaucracy towards immigration really began, wasn't it?
Yes, the Chinese exclusion was the first federal law passed in 1882 that excluded a group of people from the United States, the Chinese, based on their race, right? The logic was that Chinese were unassimilable, that they could never be Americans, and therefore they were a racial danger. And I'm so glad you pointed to Frederick Douglass, because his vision of America was a democratic one, right? Where all peoples, regardless of their origin, could live together as equals. And unfortunately, that did not come to pass in the 19th century. We had instead a triumph of white supremacy, which was paralleled with Jim Crow in the South and with Chinese exclusion in the West.
Professor, many Americans, especially white Americans, believe that their grandparents came, quote unquote, the right way. And I know my own personal history. My grandparents did not come the right way. So could you explain the facts?
Europeans are very fond of saying, my people came the right way, by which they mean they came legally. Now, before World War I, there were virtually no restrictions on immigration, notwithstanding Chinese exclusion. But some 20 million people came through Ellis Island between 1890 and World War I. You didn't need a passport. You didn't need a green card. There was no such thing as a green card. There wasn't any such thing as a quota. You just came. And 98% of the people who showed up at Ellis Island before World War I got in, 98%. So I always tell people, well, there's no special honor in being legal if everybody is legal. You only have the problem or the category of the illegal when you have restrictions. And then immigration will divide into two streams, one of which is legal and one of which is unauthorized.
Well, that romantic notion of America, Emma Lazarus' wonderful sonnet inscribed on the Statue of Liberty, that was a period when America, I guess, embraced immigrants in order to grow, but then all of a sudden there is this dramatic shift. Why?
Well, America was embracing immigrants in order to grow, exactly, because the economy needed labor. It needed massive amounts of unskilled labor to work in the factories and to build the cities. But even as that was going on, even in Emma Lazarus's time, there was always a countercurrent against immigrants. There were people who believed that the new immigrants, so-called new immigrants from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, were undesirable. They believed they were degraded races. They did not think of them on the par with Nordic whites. So there was political movement for restriction as early as the 1890s. And it was not until after World War I that Congress was able to pass a comprehensive restriction bill.
It's really very interesting, the history of those who were not turned away at the border to help build this country. And now, Professor, some of the descendants of those very immigrants themselves are opposed to other immigrants coming into the country and having the same access to American prosperity.
I think it's unfortunate that almost every immigrant group that comes wants to pull the ladder up behind them and is against the next group. That's something we've seen throughout our history. As the European immigrants became accepted as whites, they began to think that their own socioeconomic standing and mobility was something that they had worked very hard for, and that newer immigrants weren't working as hard. I mean, all immigrants do work hard. I don't dispute that for a moment. But the reason why you had so much mobility among Europeans, or their children and grandchildren, I should say, in the middle of the 20th century, was not just because they worked hard. It was because we had an expanding economy. We had an explosion of jobs in professions and technical sectors. You had the GI Bill, which enabled white Americans to go to college for free and get low interest mortgage rates in the suburbs. So there were a lot of, you could say, affirmative actions for white people, including European immigrants and their children, to get ahead. And nowadays, none of those, we don't have that situation anymore. So it's not really the fault of the individual. We live in a situation of very different conditions.
Well, I'm so glad you're going to be with us in the next segment. So folks, don't go away. Come back here at State of Play. Welcome back to State of Play. We are very lucky indeed. We have Professor Mae Ngai. You spoke of the conceit of human beings thinking that they could block other human beings from coming into their country, whatever the country. So should one even have an aggressive bureaucracy trying to regulate immigration?
I don't think we should, because human beings have been moving around since time immemorial. Some of it's for adventure, but most of it is because people look for better opportunities for themselves and their families. So if we think about migration as being something driven primarily by the unequal distribution of resources around the world, then we can understand that people are going to move. And you can accommodate that, you can welcome them, you can share the resources, and we can build a better world.
Professor, speaking about what drives immigration, what impact has U.S. foreign policy had, especially in Latin America?
Well, it has a tremendous impact, especially what's going on right now with the people coming from Central America. They are not immigrants in the typical sense. They are people seeking asylum. They are refugees. And what they are fleeing from are civil violence and disorder, which can be traced directly to U.S. military intervention and political intervention in those regions. So the instability that you see is directly related to U.S. foreign policy.
You mentioned earlier, too, Professor, how some of the original settlers to this country actually were not immigrants. And yet we find today many immigrants from European countries have an easier time immigrating to America as opposed to those immigrants from countries of color who are people of color. Why is that? And does there need to be some policy to change that?
Yes, we do need to change our policy. Absolutely. Right now, we have a system where visas are allocated to new immigrants, green cards, on a formula that gives the same number or has the same cap for every country. It's like 26,000 and change. So that is supposed to be a policy of equality, and yet India is not the same as New Zealand. Mexico is not the same as Belgium. And so what is on the surface a policy of treating all countries the same, I think is actually a vastly unequal policy.
Well, given all the challenges and given your command of the history around immigration, are you encouraged, discouraged, or what regarding the Biden administration's efforts?
Well, thank goodness we are emerging from a nightmare of 4 years of cruelty and inhumane treatment of immigrants. I am very hopeful that the Biden administration will improve not just the conditions or the policies, but how we even respect immigrants as human beings. So he has a very progressive agenda, and the bill that's sponsored by Senator Menendez, I think, is really progressive. It remains to be seen how much of that can get through the Congress. But there are a lot of obstacles, there are a lot of challenges. There are a lot of people now showing up at the border, knowing that Biden is more progressive. And that's a challenge that the administration has to deal with in terms of processing their asylum claims in a timely manner.
Well, Professor Ngai, you have been terrific, and your command of this subject and your passion around it are so compelling. So we're very, very grateful for your joining us here on State of Play.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome back to State of Play. We are very lucky indeed. We have with us now the president of UnidosUS, Janet Murguía. UnidosUS has to be one of the most powerful, effective advocacy organizations in this country. And Janet Murguía, maybe you can explain to me, how is it in 2021 we're so embroiled in this issue of immigration when we're supposed to be a nation of immigrants?
You know, it's a great question. Thank you, Madam Mayor, for including me on today's segment. I'll just tell you, we're all shaking our heads. I'll have to admit that none of us thought that the harm that the Trump administration could create could be so deep and so unconscionable and so horrendous. But in fact, it was. And so you have now a Biden administration that's trying to undo the dismantling of what should have been a very thoughtful and strategic approach to refugees and asylees, and then capitalizing on the opportunity to once and for all reform our immigration system in a comprehensive way. But it's hard to quantify the damage that was done by the Trump administration. For the first time, a horrendous policy, a zero tolerance policy where they talked and actually instituted practices that separated parents from their children at the border. This is contrary to our own laws and to international laws. And in addition to that, placing these children in cages, literally cages. So the Biden administration has literally had to start from scratch and at a deficit, because many of the programs that were set up to establish border management programs with this issue has been completely dismantled. And I'll tell you, the real source of the crisis is in these countries in Central America, the Northern Triangle, where the source of migration has been left unresolved for the last 4 years. So we're really dealing with the situation where President Biden and Vice President Harris are trying to create and really institute new policies that can be more consistent with our values. But it's hard because they've had to undo all of this unwinding of damaging policies. So here we are trying to figure out not only how to best manage this situation at the border, how to tackle these issues in the source countries where families are feeling like the only measure they have is to leave, and now deal with the issue here in the US of finally dealing with immigration reform. So it's mind-boggling, but here we are.
Janet, good to see you again, and thanks for joining us. 60% of the 3.4% of undocumented human beings here in America have been here for over a decade. So they're a big part of the U.S. economy, aren't they? I mean, what would happen if they weren't contributing to the U.S. economy?
Absolutely. So many of these individuals are inextricably linked with our families, our communities, and the country. There are millions of American families who have at least one undocumented person living with them. And our research has shown that nearly 6 million U.S. citizen or lawfully present children have one or more undocumented parents or close family members. So that is why our top legislative priority has been to legalize the status of long-term undocumented residents, and why we're so adamant that immigrant enforcement should be targeted at those who pose a threat to their community. No one here is for open borders. We have to have the ability to secure our borders, but we can manage them in a way that is consistent with our laws and our values. And we should not be in the business of breaking up the families of millions of American children. And no one should have to be looking over their shoulder, especially after this pandemic. And we've seen the role that many essential workers have played. Latino and immigrant families, 70% of them have been essential workers. We need to legalize a path for citizenship and create a path for legalization for many of these folks who have been here over a generation, because we're going to continue to need their contributions into the future. The pandemic showed whether they were working in the farms and working to provide food on the table, or caring for our elderly and those who are sick, or perhaps in the meatpacking plants and chicken processing plants, or as first responders. All of these are essential workers, and they're largely represented by Latinos and immigrants. We need to find a way for them to continue to make these important contributions. And that's why we're working on paths to citizenship and the importance for Congress to act on this in a comprehensive way.
Janet, you're so right. I don't know what we would have done without these workers, especially during COVID. With these undocumented individuals also pay a lot of taxes. They pay $80 billion in federal taxes, $40 billion plus in state taxes. It isn't part of the debate, though. How do we change that?
You're right, Karen. For so many folks out there, the disinformation that surfaces when it comes to immigration reform, the politics that are played on this, really creates a lot of misperceptions about the contributions that immigrants and undocumented immigrants even make. I mean, for instance, we know that contributions from undocumented individuals help shore up Social Security, just that program alone, for all Americans to the tune of $13 billion a year. And yet we also know that these workers are never going to be able to benefit from the Social Security themselves. So one of the consequences of the effort to turn immigration into a red meat issue, essentially the core strategy of the last administration, is that we are unable to even have a conversation about the need to have immigration reform. Essentially, what policies do we need to implement that serve both the interest of immigrants and our country? None of this is able to happen in a rational way, because I think that folks prefer to use it as a wedge. And oftentimes that means in our community, the potential benefits that these workers would have of contributing even more if they were legally here would even be bigger. And that gets lost in the politics of people who just don't want to see immigration reform and feel it's still a threat to current workers, when we can point to report after report that actually shows that's just not the case. These folks can be leveraged to make really important contributions to our economy.
I have reason to believe that both President Biden and Vice President Harris are watching our show right now, as they do every week. So as you have them as a captive audience, Janet, what would you suggest they do at this moment, even more, to secure the legal rights of all who are undocumented?
Well, I would applaud already some of the actions that President Biden has already taken, consistent with his campaign promises, executive actions that have provided some protective status for DACA beneficiaries, often known as Dreamers, and also extending some protected status and stabilization for what we call temporary protected status holders, TPS holders. And I would applaud the bill that he has announced that would actually be a comprehensive effort to reform our system, and just say, keep pushing at it. We appreciate bipartisan support, but essential workers should benefit from any job program into the future. And our hope would be that he would support essential workers in the future and provide a path to citizenship.
Well, Janet Murguía, you have been terrific, and congratulations on all the great work you're doing. And thank you for being a part of State of Play.
Wonderful to see you all today.
I couldn't have a civil rights career without broadcasting, and I couldn't be a broadcaster without intersecting civil rights. We are living in an era of the greatest disinformation we've ever seen. I think State of Play is going to play an important role in diffusing the chatter from what's actually pertinent for people to know for their well-being.
Welcome back to State of Play, where we're talking about the essential immigrant. And Karen, I want to ask you about this letter that was sent to President Biden from both members of the House, members of the Senate. From what I can discern, only Democrats, but they think it's urgent that the president come up with a pathway to provide citizenship to these essential workers. Where does that go?
Well, it's a very good question, Mayor. First of all, it is the right thing to do. It is consistent with our values. It's also consistent with what we've learned from COVID. Documented and undocumented workers have been essential to us in this pandemic. But, based on what we've heard and based on what we see every day, even though the American people are in support, I'm just not sure we've got the leadership in the Republican Party to get this done.
As I look at the language as it appears on the screen, it's almost paradoxical. Immigrant and essential. And it seems to me the word essential should override immigrant. And in this country for too long, we've treated immigrants as really less than human. And that's what I think really needs to change. And these individuals risk their lives in a pandemic to go and reopen the hospitality industry. Many of them even work in the very medical industry where we get treated. They risk their lives. Many of them even caught COVID, but they had to go to work because they had no choice. These were jobs where people could not afford to stay home. They risked their lives in COVID. Also, Mayor and Karen, and at the same time, didn't have the protections that others had. While they're doing that, as we see in the next graphic, they are contributing over $17 billion to Social Security, $4 billion to Medicare, pay-as-you-go systems, where the rest of us who are full citizens get our benefits. It's unfair to leave them out of that equation, especially since they've been so essential to all of us.
There's no question about that. They want to always paint them as if they are dole on the system when they contribute to the system, not only in terms of skill sets, enthusiasm to work, young enough to work, which many of us may not be, and then they make a significant contribution to something like Social Security and Medicare. So it is a lack of logic to me as to why people resist it.
Well, Mayor, you're absolutely right. I mean, and in addition, they're paying billions in federal taxes, billions in state taxes. And, that is not even part of the debate. Another issue that isn't part of the debate is just immigrant women. And we see on the screen, 2.7 million immigrant women are working in healthcare. They are our healthcare providers again. And this just bears repeating. During COVID, who was taking care of us? Immigrants. In hospitals, even in our homes, in our residential care facilities, in our nursing homes. And at the same time, the Trump administration previously were trying to kick them out.
And again, we see a great deal of disproportionality. It is foreign-born workers and women who have lost more jobs in that COVID economy. Again, we are looking at a bunch of paradoxes. Immigrants, yet essential, yet the most to lose jobs in the economy, while they are making a great contribution to the longevity of the rest of us through Social Security and Medicare. And again, I just want to reiterate, as we talk about women, women are in a lot of these jobs, as you said, Karen. They're losing more jobs in the COVID economy than even men are. We cannot demand humanity when it comes to every other aspect of American life, including what we see with police violence. We cry out for humanity, for victims in that situation. This situation, when it comes to immigration and essential workers and women, that cries out for humanity as well.
Well, it seems grievance politics trumps, and this time the verb works, logic in terms of policies and practices, sometimes in the past, because for a very long time, particularly Republicans were very supportive of that H-1B1 visa because of the skill sets that they desperately needed in Silicon Valley. And now you can't get a Republican, even those who've been successful business people, to get on board with a logical, rational, humane immigration policy now. And, are we at a point where we're just so polarized? The politics is such that you're just so polarized, logic can't prevail at all.
Well, and I think one of the things, that's up on the screen is this 34% of Americans approve of Biden's handling of immigration, while 53% disapprove. To your point, Mayor, this is misleading, right? What people are seeing on TV is a so-called border crisis. It's not a crisis, but the press is pushing it. And the more they push it, the more people believe that it's not being handled properly. And the more that impacts an approval rating of, the president who's only been in office for not even 100 days. Yet the Republicans see this as an opportunity to just drive home their anti-immigrant message. And I might add, these are Republicans where, the number of immigrants in their state are, the smallest percentage, but it doesn't make any difference because they're driving this message for a whole other reason.
And one of the other reasons, quite frankly, is that they want to dirty up President Biden. They have not found a scandal that sticks to him. He's not a person of color. He's not a woman. It's a lot easy to scandalize women and people of color. All right. He's a white male like everyone else. Blue collar and all that. They can't do it. They couldn't do it with his son, Hunter Biden. So they have to manufacture this crisis that doesn't really exist. So I think those numbers show the effect that right-wing media and trolls are doing with that. But, I think we have to acknowledge that the real fight is getting people to accept the humanity of others. There are those in this country who just don't want to let go, even though their ancestors came here safely and were accepted. They don't want others to come here safely and be accepted. And Trump helped to bring that even more to the surface most recently. The xenophobia, the white supremacy, the racism. We don't want people of color. We don't want the others here in America. We will not accept them. And that's just dead wrong, because they're doing the work. These others are doing the work that other Americans are not doing and are no longer able to do. And they bring richness to the fiber of this country. They are part of this too. They should not be left out of the dream of American prosperity, Mayor.
No, there's no question about it. And I think that unfortunately, people are playing to the fears of America as the demographics change, and therefore there's anxiety about, what is my standing in America, as against what is very logical, who we need in skill sets, who we need in order to rejuvenate the country, because we need that youth here in America, or just the practicality of trying to block people from coming into a country. So that's why I'm glad we're having a conversation today about the essential immigrant. So don't go away. Stay here at State of Play. Welcome back to State of Play. Our topic today is immigration policies in the United States of America. We're very lucky indeed. We have a very special guest. He was the past president of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. He's a partner with Ulmer and Byrne and a major force on this front. Welcome to David Leopold.
Thanks for having me.
So you are a very effective voice on this issue, and also a very passionate voice on this issue. How is it and why is it that you became so involved in this area?
That's a great question, Mayor. I am the son of a Holocaust survivor. So I think at bottom, that's probably what led me to this, having been raised at the knee of a refugee, having a family that's, my own family is split over continents forever because of a government. So I think that wasn't a conscious move, but I think at bottom, that's probably what led me into this work.
Yeah. Well, that's a compelling story. You also seem not very happy with the Trump administration. To what extent was it more than just some harm done during his administration?
Oh my gosh, Mayor. It was unprecedented. The level of cruelty, the level of destruction. I mean, we can list many of them. I mean, I think most people will think about the separation of children at the border. I would call that kidnapping. They took children coming in as refugees with their parents, tried the parents for a criminal offense, and took the kids, used it as a pretext to take the kids and put them into a system that is not designed to reunite the children, because they put them into a system that was designed for unaccompanied children, kids who came by themselves. It was an intentional assault, not only on immigration and asylum, but on the principle of what this country is supposed to be about what this American experiment is. And that was child separation. Internally, they destroyed families for 4 years by going after moms and dads, grandparents, dreamers, young immigrants, as opposed to going after national security risks and people who would do the country harm, as President Obama had done in the last 2 years of his administration. As a matter of business immigration, they restricted global companies from bringing in highly skilled workers. They specifically focused on immigrants of color. Everybody pretty much knows about the Muslim ban, but go to Columbus, Ohio, and talk to the Mauritanian population down there that suffered an onslaught and a violent attack, as it were, by U.S. immigration, by the Trump administration. We know how President Trump referred to African countries, and that's really what he thought of African countries, African Americans, immigrants of color. I could just go on and on. The destruction was enormous. It is reparable in many cases, but it's going to take a long time.
So what policies, if you were advising President Biden now, which you may be, I don't know, what would be the 2 or 3 major policies you think he needs to initiate in order to put us on the correct course?
Well, I think, mostly in the news has been the border, and it's a very tough issue. It's an issue that represents many of the failings of American policy over many decades. Every one of the presidents that we've had over the last several decades has had to deal with immigrants coming in, migration from the southern border, and President Trump is no different. What he's doing, I hope, that is different, and I think is wise, is focusing on the root causes of the migration, focusing on the economic problems, the climate change issues that have led to hurricanes and other problems in Central America, which have caused people to come up here. And my hope is that President Biden, through Kamala Harris, who's going to be leading, the vice president, who's going to be leading the diplomatic effort, will finally get to the root cause. But I think we also have to remember that this isn't going to happen overnight. This isn't a simple problem. This is a problem that dates back decades, and it may take that kind of time to fix it. So that's with respect to the border. With respect to internally, I think they've started off on the right foot. They've reversed many of the most abhorrent Trump policies of going after families. And now they're going after people who really pose a danger, a calculable danger to the community, as opposed to, young immigrants who came here as children called dreamers, as opposed to family members and hardworking folks, essential workers now we know during the pandemic. So the internal enforcement, I think, is issue number two. And issue number three is really business immigration and lifting the restrictions that were put on many businesses. We operate in a global economy, obviously. And with that global economy comes people into the country and out of the country. And by closing off our borders and by restricting business immigration, the Trump administration really, without any rational basis, rational thought, really hurt our business immigration in this country.
So President Biden, along with obviously Vice President Harris, is trying to correct policies we've had in place that still put limits on who can come into the United States. And I guess my question to you, as someone who's wrestled with this all the time, does it make sense to put those kind of limits in an environment where climate change is only growing more threatening, where we need the talent wherever we can find it, where we need to rejuvenate our society? Do you think that it makes sense to even have any of these limitations?
Well, I think we need to also think about what this country needs internally, what our economic needs are, the needs of U.S. workers and U.S. families, making sure that our people are healthy and strong and able to work. But I understand what you're saying in terms of the limits. So I think what needs to happen, Mayor, is that Congress needs to really roll up its sleeves here and think through these questions you just asked, because these are huge policy questions. These are thorny, difficult questions. These are questions really at bottom about who we are as a nation, who we are, our culture, where we've been and where we're going, who do we let in and who do we not let in. If we come at it with the premise of having a regulated immigration system, my vision, my personal vision, for what it's worth, would be that we have a system that respects the rule of law, that's fair, that offers asylum and refugee seekers a reasonable, fair, full opportunity to make their case, and treats them, everybody who wants to come here, with dignity and respect. I think there should be limits. What those limits are, I think, is a major policy question. But we can't get to that question unless Congress, and mainly right now what that means is the Republicans in Congress, really are willing to make some difficult choices and move forward on this issue rather than using it as a political weapon to keep from moving forward.
Who are the leaders in Congress you think that could provide that bridge that you're talking about, where Democrats and Republicans could fashion something together?
Well, I think the Democratic leadership has been standing up for it. The House has passed two important bills over the last couple of months: a bill that protects dreamers, a bill that protects farm workers. Hopefully, they'll be considering the essential workers. There was a letter that was sent recently to the president from members of Congress. Unfortunately, they're operating in an environment, the Democrats are, and the president is, where there's no reach out from the other side. Would that the Republicans would put the country first. And I don't mean to get partisan here. I think I'm speaking out of what I see as a matter of fact. There really needs to be some ground given by the Republicans. They need to come together and start working with this president and with this Congress, with the leadership in both houses.
Well, you've been terrific. I mean, at one time, the Republicans wanted H-1B1 folks here because of the talent. But thank you so much, David Leopold, for being on State of Play.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Welcome back to State of Play. We've had a very lively, animated conversation today about essential immigrants. And we've heard from Janet Murguía, who does a brilliant job with UnidosUS. We heard from David Leopold, who really said, in many ways, what we're seeing today reminds him of what his father faced in a fascist Europe. And then we heard from Professor Mae Ngai, who gave us the arc of history around the essential immigrant. And she explained that America didn't begin with immigrants; those were settlers. But our best days were when we were welcoming at Ellis Island. But now we have a different dynamic, do we not?
Well, Mayor, I think you referred to this a number of times, the logic of this. There is no logic to this. We are not looking at our society, our economy, and saying, what do we need? Who do we need? How do we expand growth? How do we share prosperity? Mark always refers to the sharing of prosperity. You know, we're not looking at any of the issues that are important and frankly key to our nation. You know, it is even worse than identity politics. It's hatred.
And it's also hateful in the sense that those who would keep immigrants out, those who would be xenophobic toward them, those who would discriminate toward them, those that would commit hate crimes toward them, deny the fact that these are individuals who help make America a better nation, who do the essential work in the medical industry, in the hospitality industry, in the food industry. To disregard them or stamp them out really is very much akin to the beginning of this country when African Americans were enslaved. We were mistreated, yet still expected to pick and cook and clean and raise children. Now we're treating many immigrants the very same way. They're getting paid. Those enslaved didn't get paid. But the immigrants getting paid are not even being paid livable wages. I want to commend you, Mayor. It's important that we have this forum, State of Play, and that we have this conversation, because I would encourage people to reflect upon all the great information that was shared on this episode and thereby have a greater understanding about why we need to care about the others, care about those who come into this country and do so many important things to make America the nation that it is.
Well, all of it's being driven by fear. People are feeling unsettled by the changing demographics in the country. I mean, that may be presumptuous on my part to say that's the driving force here. But what we do need to do, and hopefully this conversation helps us do, is embrace the point of view that Frederick Douglass articulated, where when he spoke out against the Chinese Exclusion Act, that we're in it together and we need to embrace our better angels and aspire to be the best of what America promises to be. So I am really glad we did drill down on this issue and understand that the immigrant of today is essential to our own prosperity, for our own goodwill. And I'm so grateful that we had this lively conversation today on State of Play.